On October 5th, 2018, a teenager beat a jail guard on camera. His name was Kalief Browder. He was 17 years old. It happened inside a Rikers Island housing unit called RNDC. Guards did not stop it fast. The video leaked later. It showed Browder landing punch after punch while the officer tried to fight back. 1 week later, Browder walked free. He posted just $1,500 in bail. A jail source told reporters the plain truth. It's likely he will be in our custody again. Not a threat, not a guess, just a fact about how the system worked. If you like true crime where the real villain is not one person but a whole broken system, hit subscribe. You're in for a ride. Today, we'll break down how Rikers Island keeps creating the very violence it claims to stop. Kalief Browder. Browder's file already showed 8 prior arrests for assault, robbery, fraud, and weapons possession. He'd been arrested that September for a separate assault, released, then arrested again for the RNDC beating less than 3 weeks later. $1,500. That's less than a month's rent in most of New York City, and it was the full price of walking away from a beating that had already been viewed thousands of times online. Bail wasn't even posted by the state. It came from a private group called Robert F. Kennedy Human Rights, running a mass bailout program aimed at freeing women and minors from Rikers, regardless of their record or charges. City Councilman Robert Holden called the release utterly irresponsible and demanded a city council hearing into how a teenager with 8 prior arrests ended up on that list. A City Hall spokeswoman said the mayor's office had zero input into who the foundation chose to bail out and that the incident could very well result in an arrest of its own. The nonprofit pushed forward anyway, and its bailout program had already been plagued by problems, including several released inmates who skipped court entirely afterward. The union representing officers used the video to demand tougher rules for anyone caught assaulting staff on camera. The Department of Correction called it unacceptable. That was the same word the department used for dozens of attacks before Browder and dozens more after him. The math told every inmate watching exactly what Rikers Island considered a serious consequence. It wasn't even rare. A near-identical attack had happened at the same facility weeks earlier. A different inmate, a different guard, the same pattern of footage spreading online faster than any investigation could move. Over the next few years, case after case would prove Browder's release wasn't some rare mistake. It was the baseline. Malik Facey. Bronx prosecutors thought Malik Facey was done making headlines once he landed inside Rikers Island. For a while, they were right. He was already awaiting trial, accused of killing a man named James Weeks on the Lower East Side back in July of 2019, a bystander struck by a stray bullet. The jail was supposed to be a pause button on his life, a holding cell until a jury decided his fate. On the afternoon of August 16, 2022, Facey turned that pause button into a second crime scene of his own. At the George R. Vierno Center, around 2:25 p.m., during what officials described only as a melee, Facey walked up to a correction captain and stabbed him in the neck. The weapon was recovered at the scene. The captain was rushed to Mount Sinai Hospital in Queens, listed in stable condition. Officials never said what set the attack off. It happened during an ordinary shift, the kind of quiet afternoon that made up most days at Rikers Island. DOC Commissioner Louis Molina called it a heinous assault on a captain who was just doing his job, adding that violence against staff would never be tolerated. By this point, the department had used that same line so many times it barely made news outside New York. Facey's file already had a murder charge on it for a killing prosecutors said happened in broad daylight on a city street. Now it had a second violent charge. And this one happened inside a place that was supposed to be the one part of his life where violence got contained by design, by staffing, by walls. Every detainee at Rikers is supposed to pass through metal detectors and body scans before ever reaching a housing unit. Somehow, none of that stopped a weapon from reaching Facey's hands or reaching the captain's neck. Instead, Rikers Island handed him a captain within arm's reach, and somehow a blade sharp enough to reach him with. Nobody in the department could explain on the record how that blade got past intake screening. The investigation went nowhere fast, and it wouldn't be the last time that exact question came up with no real answer attached. If a stabbed captain sounds bad, wait until you hear what one inmate did to 32 different officers in 6 months. Captain Awais Ghori. Captain Awais Ghori had already survived his share of violence at Rikers Island long before that inmate showed up on his radar. Years earlier, on Thanksgiving Day, November 23, 2017, an inmate named Jason Reed had ambushed him inside the Otis Bantam Correctional Center. Reed, a member of the Bloods, had threatened 3 weeks earlier to cut Ghori after the captain used pepper spray to break up a fight between inmates. Nobody acted on the threat. Nobody moved Reed to a different unit or restricted his contact with the captain. The threat just sat there on the record, unaddressed, for 21 days. Then Reed made good on it. He gathered 14 other inmates in a circle. About 90 minutes later, when Ghori walked into the area, surveillance video shows Reed leading the attack, hitting him from behind and knocking him to the floor. 14 inmates stole a canister of pepper spray, tried to steal a second, and physically blocked other officers from reaching him. 2 nearby captains turned and ran instead of helping. Ghori fought back alone until a female officer rushed in and pulled inmates off him. He was left with a laceration on his neck and cuts across his face and mouth. Bronx District Attorney Darcel Clark called it a chilling picture of the society of violence on Rikers Island, with gang members who think they control the jails. But they do not, she added. The rule of law does. 15 inmates were eventually indicted on gang assault charges. Ghori recovered, received a commendation for valor, and went right back to work at facilities that house the mentally ill and the physically ailing. Years later, that same captain would find himself staring at a different inmate's file and wondering if anyone above him was paying attention at all. Michael Megginson. Between roughly 2022 and 2023, an inmate named Michael Megginson assaulted correction officers so often that his file read less like a record and more like a running tally that never stopped climbing. This wasn't new behavior for Megginson. A 1915 New York Times profile of him had already documented 70 separate physical clashes with correction officers over 18 months, and argued he belonged in a psychiatric hospital, not a jail. Nobody changed course. Years later, he was still cycling through Rikers, and the number of officers he'd gone through kept climbing. Just over half of his attacks in this stretch involved throwing liquid on officers, a move so common at Rikers that staff had a name for it. Court records showed 3 open assault cases running against him at the same time. He allegedly slashed one officer with a pen, a wound that took 8 stitches to close. He tried to attack a second officer with a shiv. He beat a third officer with metal restraints he'd been forced to wear. 32 officers assaulted by one man in 6 months. That is not a typo, by the way. Spread evenly, that's more than 1 assault every single week for half a year straight. And even after all of that, Megginson later sued the city himself, claiming correction officers had used excessive force against him during one of their responses. A federal judge let that lawsuit move forward too, which meant the same jail was simultaneously accused of failing to control him and of brutalizing him. Both things, in a place like Rikers, turned out to be true at once. Captain Ghori put the question directly to his own department in an email that later became public. Has the DOC system completely failed us? How can 32 officers be assaulted by one inmate in 6 months? Who is going to take responsibility for all these assaults? Is the federal monitor aware of these unsafe crises? Please generate a plan of action moving forward and support your staff. This wasn't a union talking point or a press release from an outside group. It was a captain from inside the system asking his own bosses if anyone up the chain was actually paying attention. Nobody gave him a real answer. Megginson wasn't transferred anywhere with tighter controls. The jail just kept absorbing the damage, one incident report at a time, filed and forgotten, while Gory's email sat unanswered in whatever inbox it landed in. If a story like this makes you wonder how a jail this documented, this sued, and this monitored keeps producing the exact same failures year after year, subscribe. We track every new Rikers case as the federal monitor's reports come out, and we're only about a third of the way through this one. Stephen Espinal. Officer Jean Souffrant had written up an 18-year-old inmate named Stephen Espinal for a minor infraction the day before. Espinal was already facing an unrelated attempted murder charge and was an alleged member of the Bloods. He did not let the write-up go. Prosecutors said he spent the next day on the phone, planning exactly how he'd make Souffrant pay for it. On February 10, 2018, inside the George Machin Detention Center, Espinal walked up to Souffrant and threw one sucker punch. It knocked Souffrant out cold before his head even hit the wall behind him. Then, as surveillance video later showed, 5 more inmates rushed in. They kicked and stomped the officer while he lay motionless on the floor. Officers finally broke it up with pepper spray, but the damage was already done. Souffrant woke up in intensive care with a fractured C2 vertebra in his neck and bleeding on his brain. DOC Commissioner Cynthia Brand called the attack sickening, saying what happened to our brother at the hands of a violent group of cowardly inmates would not go unanswered. Union President Elias Husamuddin pointed to a newer city policy that had ended solitary confinement for inmates under 21. He argued that stripping the department's ability to separate violent young offenders from everyone else had put officers like Souffrant directly in danger. This mayor has declared war on New York City correction officers, Husamuddin said. At sentencing, the judge described a correction officer's job as thankless, telling the courtroom there aren't any uplifting moments in it. Espinal was sentenced to 10 years, running alongside the 10-year sentence he already faced in his attempted murder case. Co-defendant Samson Walston got 5 years for his part in the attack. Devin Burns got 3. Bronx DA Darcel Clark said Souffrant suffered a horrendous injury while performing his duty as a civil servant, adding that she'd hoped for a tougher sentence to send a stronger message. Souffrant himself, sitting in the courtroom for the sentencing, said simply that he hoped justice was served. A planned, coordinated attack, talked through by phone ahead of time, had ended with an officer almost paralyzed over a piece of paperwork. And the fight over how to house young, violent detainees like Espinal was only getting louder from here. Dennis Applewhite. Dennis Applewhite was already at Rikers Island awaiting trial for fatally shooting his girlfriend the year before. On October 31st, 2022, at the Anna M. Cross Center, he walked up behind a correction officer and stabbed him in the back of the head 12 times with an 8-inch piece of sharpened metal. The officer survived, treated at Elmhurst Hospital for lacerations to the head, neck, and ear. The attack happened on the same day another inmate was found dead in custody, the 18th death recorded at Rikers that year alone. The timing wasn't lost on the officers' union. COBA President Benny Boscio tied the stabbing directly to a city bill moving through the council at the time, one designed to end solitary confinement across the whole jail system. This heinous, unprovoked attack on our officer who was simply doing his job comes at a time when over 1,200 officers have been assaulted, Boscio said. He argued that stripping the department's ability to separate violent inmates from everyone else would eventually get someone killed. The Department of Correction called it an abhorrent, unprovoked assault. Applewhite pleaded guilty to attempted assault and was sentenced to 10 years in prison plus 5 years of supervision after release. Applewhite's attack happened on Halloween, hours after another man had already died in custody that same day. The story barely held the news cycle's attention for more than a single afternoon. That, too, had become part of the pattern. Rikers Island produced so much violence, so consistently, that even an officer stabbed a dozen times had to compete for headline space against a body count still climbing behind him. By the end of that year, 18 people had died in the city's jails. The department confirmed the number without much comment, like it was just another line in a report nobody outside the system was reading closely. Applewhite had been sent to the Protective Custody Unit in the first place, a section built to keep vulnerable detainees separated and safer than general population. Even there, a sharpened piece of metal still found its way into a cell. Corrections officers weren't the only ones losing control of what happened inside those walls. Some inmates found it laughably easy to run entire businesses from a single cell, and it turned out at least one of them had a correction officer working for him, Michael Ross. Michael Ross didn't need to leave his housing unit at the Robert N. Daverin Center to run a supply chain. Federal prosecutors say Ross used a smuggled cell phone to coordinate more than $34,000 in bribe payments. The money moved through two women on the outside, straight to a corrections officer named Katrina Patterson, in exchange for a steady stream of contraband delivered right to his cell. The text messages investigators pulled read less like criminal masterminding and more like careless small talk between people who had stopped worrying about getting caught. One message described a delivery as 4 black joints in one paper. Patterson wrote back that it had better be wrapped enough times that she couldn't smell it. When the two later talked about deleting their messages, neither seemed too concerned about it. Surveillance footage eventually showed Patterson handing Ross the items directly. Narcotics and phones passed hand to hand inside a facility that runs metal detectors and body scanners on every visitor who walks through the front gate. An FBI assistant director called it evidence that corruption had permeated Rikers Island, polluting the integrity of the department and its institutions. Ross wasn't an outlier who'd stumbled onto some clever crack in the system either. His case was one of 6 unsealed that same month, all involving officers accused of running nearly identical setups at different facilities across the same jail complex. A separate officer, in a case unsealed around the same time, was accused of smuggling cell phones to a different inmate for nearly $10,000 in bribes. She used almost the exact same method. 6 officers, 6 inmates, 1 jail complex, all running the same basic scheme at roughly the same time, is not a story about one dirty guard. It is a story about a facility where that arrangement had quietly become routine. New York's police commissioner went further than the FBI. He called the scheme an intolerable betrayal of public trust, language usually reserved for scandals far bigger than one officer smuggling marijuana to a single detainee. Ross was sentenced to 18 months, stacked onto the 16 years to life sentence he was already serving for an unrelated conviction. Patterson got a year and a day in federal prison for taking the bribes. Ross ran his whole operation with 1 bribed employee on the inside. The next inmate on this list didn't even need to bribe anyone. He just needed a discarded uniform. Bokeem Jones. Bokeem Jones wanted out of the Otis Bantam Correctional Center. On July 27, 2023, he simply walked into an area that was supposed to be off limits to detainees. Inside, he found plastic bags full of personal belongings that correction officers had left behind years earlier, back when the facility briefly closed for renovations. Jones went digging and found a uniform that fit him, complete with a shirt, jacket, trousers, and boots. He put it on. He grabbed an umbrella left in the same area and used it to shield his face. Then he walked calmly toward the exit, moving with enough confidence that nobody gave him a second look. According to the indictment, Jones passed multiple correction officers on his way out, and not one of them stopped him. One officer, seeing what looked like a fellow officer approaching a locked door, actually unlocked it for him. A Rikers Island correction officer personally opened a secured door for the man trying to escape the jail. A stolen uniform and a cheap umbrella did exactly what they were supposed to do. Jones was finally stopped near the exit when an officer grew suspicious and asked him for his DOC shield. He didn't have one to show. He refused to stop and took what officers described as a fighting stance before 3 of them subdued him with pepper spray, injuring all 3 in the scuffle. Bronx D. A. Darcel Clark announced the indictment. 2 counts of attempted escape in the first degree, plus additional counts in the second and third degree. The entire facility was locked down for hours while investigators tried to figure out how it had happened. It was hardly an isolated bad week. That same month, jail records already showed 7 deaths in city custody for the year. An internal memo had just banned overtime for any staff who'd already hit their limit. That detail alone says a lot about how thin the staffing was, even before a man in a stolen uniform started strolling past officers unchecked. The case never made national headlines the way a stabbing would have, but it exposed something the violent cases couldn't quite capture on their own. At Rikers Island, the most basic job of any jail is knowing who's staff and who's in custody. That system had broken down so badly that a discarded uniform and a cheap umbrella nearly walked a man straight out the front door, past the very people trained to stop exactly that. Individual inmates running scams or slipping past confused guards was one kind of failure. What happened next wasn't a failure at all. It was policy, built and run by the staff themselves. Christopher Robinson. Down in the Robert N. Devoren Center, 2 correction officers, Michael McKee and Khalid Nelson, had reportedly handpicked a group of inmates and quietly handed them informal control over their own housing unit. Investigators called it the program. A month before the case that would finally expose it, another RNDC detainee, Alcides Polanco, had already been badly beaten inside the same unit. The attack was severe enough to fracture his eye socket. Investigators later reviewed the incident and began to suspect officers were, at minimum, looking the other way whenever inmates were assaulted. Nothing changed? In exchange for keeping order, the inmates enforcing the program, nicknamed the Team, were allowed to extort commissary money, phone privileges, and food from the detainees around them. McKee and Nelson allegedly showed their enforcers how to beat other inmates without leaving marks that would show up in an official report. Investigators who later reviewed the unit's culture called it a gladiator school. On October 18, 2008, 18-year-old Christopher Robinson was beaten inside his housing unit for refusing to go along with the extortion scheme. He was later found dead in his cell. The medical examiner determined he died from internal injuries. A 4-month investigation that followed uncovered 9 separate victims across 9 separate incidents in just the few months before Robinson's death, all tied to the same enforcement scheme. A grand jury unsealed a 58-count indictment against 3 correction officers and 12 teenage inmates. The charges included manslaughter, conspiracy, and enterprise corruption, a label usually reserved for organized crime bosses, not teenagers locked up in a city jail. Prosecutors described McKee as the architect of a criminal enterprise that recruited and trained inmates to inflict violence on his behalf. The Bronx district attorney at the time put it bluntly. If the allegations were true, he said, the officers' conduct was worse than that of the young detainees under their supervision. It turned a jail for teenagers into a training ground for violence, sanctioned by the very adults meant to prevent it. DOI Commissioner Rose Gilhern didn't soften her language when the indictment came down. 2 city correction officers who oversaw a shadow regime of intimidation and violence in our city adolescent jail facility have now admitted their guilt, she said. Robinson's mother, Charnel Robinson, put it more simply. Standing outside the courtroom, she said, "At the end of the day, these people are still able to see their families, but my only child is a sight I'll never see again." McKee was eventually sentenced to 2 years in prison. Nelson got 1. New York City ultimately paid $2 million to settle the lawsuit filed by Robinson's mother. Robinson's attorney told reporters the tragedy demanded a full federal review of the entire prison system, not just one unit at one facility. The federal government eventually agreed, opening its own investigation into whether staff at RNDC had failed to protect adolescent inmates as a matter of routine, not just in Robinson's case. A corrections spokeswoman confirmed the federal probe publicly, saying investigators were interested in whether staff at Rikers had failed to adequately protect inmates from harm. The easiest way to control a housing unit, it turned out, wasn't more staffing or better training. It was quietly handing the violence to inmates directly, then looking the other way while it played out. Rikers Island wasn't just failing to prevent crime inside its walls anymore. It was actively assigning it, one hand-picked enforcer at a time. Every case up to this point involved someone the system had already decided was dangerous. Someone with a record of violence long before Rikers Island ever got its hands on him. The next case is different. He was 16 years old, and he had never been convicted of anything at all. Kalief Browder. Kalief Browder was 16 in May of 2010, walking home from a party in the Bronx when police stopped him. They suspected him of stealing a backpack. He denied taking anything. His family couldn't afford the $3,000 bail the court set. So instead of going home that night, Browder went to Rikers Island. He would stay there for almost 3 years, without ever once standing trial. Nearly 700 of those days were spent in solitary confinement, alone inside a cell roughly 7 feet by 12. Browder later described being beaten by both inmates and correction officers, some of it caught clearly on the jail's own surveillance cameras, including footage from his very first day inside. While in solitary, he attempted suicide more than once, at one point tearing his bedsheet into a noose. He turned down plea deals along the way because taking one would have meant admitting guilt for a crime he insisted over and over that he never committed. Meanwhile, his case just sat on a crowded court calendar, adjourned again and again, with no trial date ever actually arriving. Browder was released at 19. The charges against him simply dropped, with no trial, no verdict, and no explanation for the 3 years that had already passed. But the years inside didn't stay behind him the way he needed them to. He enrolled in community college and tried to rebuild something close to a normal life. Friends and family described him struggling afterward with paranoia, carrying the weight of what he'd survived day by day for almost 3 years. A 2014 New Yorker profile first brought his story to a wide audience. It described in detail how solitary confinement had worn down his mind, without a single hand ever being laid on him during those stretches alone. The reporter who wrote it later said one thing stuck with her most. Browder could describe in precise detail how a mind gets worn down one empty day at a time, inside a cell roughly the size of a walk-in closet. In June of 2015, at 22 years old, Kalief Browder died by suicide inside his mother's home. His case reached further than almost any other in the jail's long history. The following year, President Obama cited Browder by name. He was announcing a federal ban on solitary confinement for juveniles. The practice was increasingly overused on people like Kalief, with heartbreaking results, Obama said. In New York City, his case became a driving force behind a citywide ban on punitive segregation for anyone under 21 at Rikers Island. A 6-part documentary series about his life followed, made with help from Jay-Z. It pushed his story even further into the national conversation than a single magazine article ever could have. In October of 2019, the City Council voted to close Rikers Island entirely. Years of documented abuse, much of it tied back to Browder's case, had helped drag that decision into public view. The legal deadline for that closure was set at 2027. That same year, the city reached a settlement of $3.3 million with Browder's family. A city spokesperson said his case had helped inspire reforms meant to keep a tragedy like his from happening again. Kalief Browder never stood trial for anything. He was never convicted of stealing a backpack or of anything else in his entire life. The institution that held him for nearly 3 years never proved he'd done what he was accused of. It took a presidential statement, an act of the city council, and a multi-million-dollar settlement just to begin admitting, years too late, what it had actually done to one 16-year-old kid. 9 cases, 4 different kinds of failure. One straight line running through every one of them. A jail that stopped being able to tell the difference between containing violence and creating it. A teenager walked free on $1,500 after beating a guard on camera. A captain's own email asking for help went unanswered for months. A jail-issued uniform left in a bag for years nearly walked a man out the front door. And 2 of the jail's own officers built an entire enforcement system out of the very violence they were paid to prevent. Rikers Island still isn't closed. The 2027 deadline keeps slipping, and every one of these cases is still working its way through appeals, lawsuits, or the federal monitor's next report. Subscribe if you want to see what that monitor finds next, because this channel will be covering it here first. Thanks for watching.